Great. Thank you all so much for joining today. I would ask that each of you if you haven't already, please put your name, your location, and your organization into the chat so we can get a sense for who is here. My name is Deborah Greben. I am a senior monitoring, evaluation, and learning advisor with the USAID Center for Education in Washington, D.C. I'm joined by two of my colleagues, Elena Walls and Rebecca Pegel, both of whom are also senior MEL advisors with the Center for Education. Yes, Elena's giving a quick wave. The purpose of today's meeting is to talk about the USAID Education Reporting Guidance, which we update annually, and to make sure you are aware of the indicators and best practices and reporting that we use in the education space with USAID. I would ask that if you have questions during the session, that you go ahead and put them in the chat. We will try to address them in the chat in writing as possible, and if not, we will save them until the end. We will have plenty of time for questions at the end. Also, to preserve bandwidth, if you could keep your video off, and we will get started here. So next slide, please. So we wanted to start off with a quick poll to get a sense for your comfort level with USAID indicators and guidance in education. If you could navigate right now to the icon in the lower right-hand portion of your screen, it's a circle, a square, and a triangle. If you click on that, there are 4 different activities listed. Then click on polls, and there is a poll that asks this question that's on your screen. How familiar are you with existing USAID education indicators and guidance? Are you a novice? Don't feel like you are familiar at all? Do you feel fairly competent, or do you feel you're a master? You're very familiar. If you check off one of those, we will give you 30 seconds, let's say, to check this off, and then we will close the poll and we'll be able to see the results at that time. So take a minute to log your feelings of competence with USAID education indicators and guidance. And we can go ahead and close the poll now. Hopefully we have enough respondents. Great, it looks like 23 of you said you feel fairly competent. About 14 said you feel like a novice, and only 2 are masters. So that's helpful feedback and background. Thank you so much. Next slide, please. So our agenda for today is really to give you an overview of USAID education reporting, to start off with why we do it, and then to review our indicator framework, and then to spend a good chunk of time on 2022 updates. We'll also touch briefly on common issues and best practices in reporting. We're going to highlight one particular indicator, our capacity building indicator, CBLD9, and then we will introduce you to our help desk to make sure you can get assistance even after this presentation. We'll introduce some key resources, and then we'll open it up for questions and discussion. Next slide. So the purpose of USAID education reporting is really to be able to, there's sort of three purposes here: feed into congressional reporting, allow us to measure our progress, particularly against the education policy, and then also to facilitate internal learning. So the way in which we do that is through an annual data call, the Performance Plan and Report, the PPR. So once a year, all operating units within USAID and the Department of State have to go through this reporting process. And so it's really important that we have accurate data to be able to to feed into all of those needs. The Center for Education Guidance supplements our official PPR guidance. It allows us to provide context to facilitate strong reporting on education-related content specifically. And it's really written for technical and program staff like yourselves who manage education-related programming regardless of the funding source. Next slide, please. One way in which we are able to showcase progress and facilitate internal learning is through education data briefs. We use both quantitative and qualitative PPR data for this, and this particular graphic here shows the reach of our USAID programs, specifically as a percent of total learners. So it helps to give a sense of the variation in the agency's reach across countries. That's just one way we've been able to showcase some of the data. Next slide, please. And then also this graphic shows how we're able to use PPR data to show changes in programming. So this one in particular shows the growth in USAID disability inclusive education programming. These briefs really help to illustrate our commitment to the priorities of the education policy, but they also help us to identify gaps and good practices within portfolios. So gaps in programming, geographic or technical gaps, gaps in reporting, gaps in disaggregate reporting, like not reporting details about marginalized learners. So we really encourage you to take a look at these. We've put the links for those data briefs and some further information into the chat for you to take a look at those. So with that, I will hand this presentation over to Dr. Elena Walls to talk about the foundation of our indicator framework. Elena.
Thank you so much, Deborah. Hi, everyone. So again, my name is Elena Walls. And now some of you might wonder where standard indicators actually come from, like why we select some and not others. So it's important to understand that USAID Education Reporting Framework is based on legislative mandates, USAID Education Policy, as well as USG Education Strategy are both supported by the Reinforcing Education Accountability in Development, or READ Act, which was passed by Congress in 2017. This act requires that all US government investments in international education are designed to produce, among other things, measurable improvements in learning outcomes for all children and youth, measurable improvements in youth employment, and demonstrable improvements in capacity of education systems. Likewise, congressional higher education directives drive reporting needs in USAID higher education portfolio. Specifically, Congress wants to see measurable improvements in capacity of higher education institutions that we work with. They also want to see increased investments in building higher education partnerships and on scholarships to improve access to higher education for women and marginalized populations. These requirements drive the content of the standard indicator framework. Next slide, please. And now to the actual framework. So you can, this slide shows how standard indicators map onto the priorities of the USAID education policy. Of course, you'll remember that we have 4 key priorities, but many indicators also support more than one policy priority. In developing this indicator framework, we try to balance the need to monitor outputs, as you can see here, top-line output indicators column, and measure outcomes of USAID education investments. You can see the middle column, top-line outcome indicators. Since the passage of the policy, we have been working to improve the quality and completeness of our indicators. We also collect feedback from our missions and implementing partners and monitor custom indicators that missions are using. That these custom indicators are sending us signals about indicator needs. And in response to this feedback, every year we tweak indicators to strengthen definitions, provide clarity on methodology of data collection, to ensure consistency and comparability of all data that comes from different activities, or introduce new indicators to close reporting gaps. This year, we're introducing a few new standard indicators, and I will tell you about them in just a minute. Next slide, please. So in addition to standard indicators that USAID shares with Department of State, we have developed a set of what we call supplemental indicators. Differently from standard indicators, which are required if applicable, supplemental indicators are optional and are used to support reporting in newer areas of work, like pre-primary education or education finance. This slide shows the summary of both existing and new supplemental indicators. The advantage of using these as opposed to custom indicators is that we have standard methodology for reporting on them, codified in the peers, thus allowing us to aggregate data from programs across the entire education portfolio. As you can see, the bulk of the indicator focuses on pre-primary, math, and education system elements, such as quality of classroom instruction and education data systems. Next slide, please. So now let me go over the new standard indicators in the basic education programming. We have three. The first new standard indicator is ES 156, number of learners with improved access to education through USG assisted programs. The performance indicator reference sheet defines what improved access means and whom to count for reporting under this indicator. As you can see over here, the 4 bullet points. This indicator is essential for reporting on progress under priority 1 of the policy that focuses on improving access to education. The second indicator is ES 158% of learners regularly participating in distance learning programming funded with USG education assistance. It captures sustained participation in structured programming through distance learning modalities such as radio, TV, phone, or online. We rolled out this indicator last year as a supplemental indicator, but beginning this year, it will be a new standard indicator, and we anticipate a high uptake given the volatility of education systems right now because of COVID-19 pandemic. Finally, the third indicator is also former supplemental indicator, AS 159, Education System Strengthened through USG-assisted policy reform. And it uses qualitative data to capture all the great work USAID activities are doing to support education sector reform. Just to sum up, these indicators provide data to inform progress against the first and second priorities of the education policy. They include disaggregates for different levels of education, crisis and conflict, and disability, if applicable. Performance indicator reference sheets that I think we already posted in the chat for these indicators provide definitions and methodological directions for how to collect data. Additional resources also available on the Edu links in dedicated briefs. And now over to Rebecca.
Thank you, Elena. Hi, everybody. I'm Rebecca Pagel, and I want to talk to you now about our new Youth Standard Foreign Assistance Indicators. So these indicators provide data to inform progress against the third priority of the USAID education policy. So the first one I want to talk about is EG 616. That's percent of individuals with improved perceived quality of employment following participation in USG-assisted workforce development programs. Now, this indicator fills a gap in our youth workforce development indicators. Some of you may recall that several years ago, we had an indicator that was number of individuals with new or better employment. And we retired that indicator and brought back an indicator on new employment. But since then, we haven't had an indicator that allows us to look at the quality of employment. And so this year, we're bringing back this indicator to allow us to understand changes in the quality of an individual's employment as a result of participation in USG programming. So this indicator provides a framework that is based on the Global Impact Investing Network's Quality Jobs Framework that allows us to measure improved quality of employment in 5 domains, which you can see on the screen there. They are earnings and wealth, health and well-being, job skills for the future, job security and stability, and labor rights. And this indicator allows respondents within the framework to influence which domains are the most important to them and therefore should be measured by us. This is our way of allowing youth in our programs to own their data and direct our interpretation of it. The second new youth indicator is Youth 6. This is number of youth who complete USG-assisted leadership programs. Now this indicator captures youth who complete programming that not only provides leadership training, but also provides opportunities for youth to practice these leadership skills. So because this indicator captures both being trained and having the opportunity to practice, all the youth reported here can be reported to Youth 1, number of youth trained in soft skills or life skills, but of course not every youth reported to Youth 1 may be reported to Youth 6. And of course the peers provide additional information, definitions, and methodological directions. Okay, oh, and there was a question in the chat about if these youth indicators will be highlighted in a cross-cutting way, perhaps in the new youth policy. And to accompany that new youth policy, we will be releasing implementation guidance. And that implementation guidance includes not only the cross-cutting youth indicators, but also a list or links to lists of youth relevant indicators across the agency. Next slide, please. Okay, thank you. I want to talk now about our new higher ed standard indicator. This indicator provides data to inform progress against the fourth priority of the education policy. This indicator, ES 255, number of learners reached by USG-assisted higher education interventions, allows us to capture the number of learners reached by programming that falls within the higher ed program framework, which you can see on your screen. We define reached as when an individual accesses meaningful opportunities for improved knowledge and skills. And while we leave the specific definition of that up to the activity, we do provide a long list of examples in the peers of what can be included and what should be excluded in this indicator. Next slide, please. So now we've spoken to you about all the new standard indicators. So now I want to speak to you a little bit about the changes we've made to existing standard indicators. So the first change that applies to all of our indicators that measure at the individual level, so all of our indicators that measure people, number of individuals or percent of individuals, is we've revised the disability disaggregate. We've revised the disability disaggregate to align with the available tools for the relevant age ranges. So now, if activities are targeting individuals under the age of 18, only those activities that are focused on improving outcomes for individuals with disabilities must report on this disaggregate. If you're working on an activity that targets individuals under the age of 18 and you're not specifically focused on improving outcomes for individuals with disabilities, you do not need to report on this disaggregate, though you are welcome to. The reason for this is we don't have lots of tools that are easily, feasibly implemented in our education programming for children and youth under the age of 18. However, for children or for youth above the age of 18 and older, rather, we have tools that are easy to implement. So if you are working on an activity that targets individuals ages 18 and older, you are required to report on these disability disaggregates. The second change is our youth age disaggregates. In years past, for our youth relevant indicators, we've had a long list of youth age disaggregates. Now that's fine for output indicators, but for our outcome indicators especially, it can increase the reporting burden, increase the cost associated with data collection and reporting. So we have streamlined those age disaggregates to, in most cases, just 2 age disaggregates, although the cross-cutting youth indicators still retain all the age disaggregates. The next change to a standard indicator is a specific change to ES 155, which is percent of learners targeted for USG assistance who have the appropriate variety of reading materials in the language of instruction with inclusive representation of diverse populations. Formerly, this indicator was specifically focused on primary education, but we revised it to clarify that we do mean to include both pre-primary and primary. All right, let's go to the next slide. So as Elena mentioned earlier, we have several supplemental indicators. And this year, we've added 2 new supplemental indicators. And again, supplemental indicators are not required, but they are there for your use. And we provide these standardized peers so that everyone reporting on these can use a standard definition. So the 2 new supplemental indicators are Supplemental 18 on pre-primary learners targeted for USG assistance with an increase of at least 1 early learning and development level in early learning skills. So this new indicator allows us to capture improvements in learning outcomes at the pre-primary level. The second new supplemental indicator is the value of private capital mobilized with USG assistance to support education. And this is designed to help us capture outcomes of investments in private and blended education finance. Next slide, please. Okay, in addition to those new supplemental indicators, we've made some changes to our existing supplemental indicators. The first change is to Supplemental 1, which is % of pre-primary learners targeted for USG assistance who are developmentally on track. We've revised this indicator to align with the new supplemental indicator, Supplemental 18, on improvement in pre-primary learning skills. And we focused this indicator on setting levels to determine if pre-primary learners are developmentally on track. The second change is to Supplemental Indicator 10, % of educators providing quality classroom instruction with USG support. Now, we had this indicator title out there in years past, but this year, for the first time, we have a peers available for you all. So please take a look at that and consider using it if it applies to your programming. Next slide, please. Okay, so before we move away from talking about changes to indicators, we want to highlight one indicator, CBLD9, that we haven't changed this year, but it's so important we want to highlight it all for you. So CBLD9 is the % of USG-assisted organizations with improved performance. And this indicator emphasizes not just capacity development, which has been a focus of USAID in years past, but it focuses on capturing improved organizational performance. Under this indicator, organizations must demonstrate and document a process of performance improvement that includes assessing performance gaps, defining a specific metric to capture changes in performance, and of course then reporting on progress against that specific metric. There's a new CBLD9 measurement guide that includes an overview of, it includes lots of resources and guidance, including an overview of tools, best practices, and even education-specific examples. So we encourage you all to look at that, but also note that we are currently working on education-specific guidance on CBLD9, and that will be coming out in the summer and will contain much more specific guidance to the education sector. Okay, thank you all so much. With that, I'll hand this over to Deborah to talk about reporting.
Great, thank you so much. I would like to spend just a couple minutes here talking about common issues with reporting. So I'd like to start off by just talking about how we use custom indicators. Many people use custom indicators when there are close standard or supplemental indicators available. We have spent a lot of time working on the standard and supplemental indicators that we've just reviewed. And it's really our way to be able to showcase our progress and aggregate across OUs and across all of our activities to be able to showcase what our progress, to showcase the good work that we're doing. So when missions or IPs use custom indicators that are close and they could be using a standard or supplemental indicator, it's really a lost opportunity, unfortunately. So we highly recommend that folks make themselves familiar with the guidance and review each indicator to make sure there is no close indicator that they could use instead of a specific custom indicator. Second, we often see folks not reporting on applicable disaggregates. Disaggregates are really particularly a tool for us being able to show the reach of our programming with marginalized learners. And so when we don't take that opportunity to report on those disaggregates, again, it's a missed opportunity to be able to show our reach to marginalized learners. Third, we often see folks using unrealistic targets, either because they haven't taken a proper baseline or they didn't have a good sense of how to calculate the target, and this can cause problems or issues down the line. And so on the next slide, I'll talk to you a little bit about some guidance that we recommend using to be able to better report on targets and do target setting. And then finally, having too many indicators. Not only is this just unnecessary, it's can be a management burden, can be a financial burden, and really we recommend honing down the number of indicators just to those that are most important for decision making and management. Next slide, please. So best practices in reporting, many of which are related to the common issues I just talked about. First of all, disaggregating indicator data. So disaggregating particularly to represent the most marginalized. So this is our way to tell Congress and other stakeholders how we're meeting our education policy priorities, particularly around youth, children and youth with disabilities, children and youth that are affected by conflict and crisis, and girls and young women. So if those disaggregates are left unreported, the numbers are going to fall short of what missions have actually achieved. Missions and IPs are, of course, welcome to add any disaggregates that are relevant for programming in a particular country or context, but we want to especially flag those that are listed in the peers for each indicator. Second best practice is reporting on both numerators and denominators. So for many of our indicators that are reported as a percent, they require us using both a numerator and a denominator, but we often find that folks will just report the percentage or potentially use numbers that aren't accurate to be able to get the percentage that they want. In doing so, that's, again, a missed opportunity, and we actually use those numerators and denominators and aggregate them across missions. So it's very important that those are reported accurately. They should be based on actual numbers of beneficiaries reached rather than just reporting whatever number gives the desired percentage. And then finally, I mentioned setting realistic targets. We have some great guidance that was produced not that long ago, which we have put the link for that guidance in the chat. This guidance, target setting guidance, includes explanations of how indicators and targets can be used as management tools. It includes in-depth guidance on conducting the target setting process, and it also includes tools and examples to support the application of the process. So we highly recommend you take a look at that guidance and use it for your programming. Next slide. So we would now like to, again, run a quick poll. We're not going to use the poll function here. If you could just enter into the chat one or two of the most important things you've learned with this presentation over the last 20 minutes or so. What has been most helpful for you? And of course, if you have questions, we are happy to receive those as well. We just want to get a sense for what has been most helpful for you up to this point. Okay, so I see common issues in reporting. Yes, and there's one comment about making up their own indicators. Of course, in many cases, that's necessary, but where it's applicable, where it's possible, we absolutely recommend using our standard and supplemental indicators. So best practices has been important, useful for folks. The higher education standard, higher education framework, target setting guidance, so some of the resources we've produced and shared. Great. Continue to put these in. This is very helpful information for us to know what is useful for you all. While you continue to put those into the chat, I will move on to the next slide, which here we just want to highlight for you that we have a resource, an email address that you can email at any point with specific questions about indicators, USAID education indicators. And that email address is edindicators@usaid.gov. Please take note of it. We're happy to receive your inquiries and answer them as quickly as we can. Of course, we've showcased this link multiple times throughout this presentation, but the main link we want you to take away from this presentation is the education reporting toolkit at edulinks.org/indicators. And then there are several points of contact within the Center for Education. The three of us on the call right now, Elena, Rebecca, and I, who all are technical POCs for basic education, pre-primary youth workforce development, and higher education. We're points of contact for those indicators, as well as our colleague Benjamin Silla, who is the overall POC for that. Next slide. So in terms of resources we wanted to highlight, we've highlighted a number of these already. Some of these are a little bit redundant, but we wanted to make sure you're well aware of these. First is we have a whole number of resources on disability measurement that we encourage you to take a close look at. Those include a tool selection guide, a how-to note, and also very soon we are going to have a disability data toolkit that is coming. So people look out for that on education links. We also have a number of resources on the Workforce Outcomes Reporting Questionnaire, which allows folks to be able to measure employment and earnings. And so there's a whole toolkit on that. There is a discussion group with Youth Power, and then there's also, as was highlighted earlier, a brief on the new quality of employment indicator that we encourage you to take a look at if you do any programming in this area. Of course, the target setting guidance that we referenced, the CBD9 capacity building indicator resource page that has lots of resources. And then we also wanted to highlight some other indicators that are relevant in the education space, which are around private sector engagement, the PSE indicators. So Lori has just put the link to that in the chat. We would encourage you to take a look at those if they are relevant for any programming you're doing. And then, of course, we will send out an email after this webinar with all of these resources linked, as well as other key takeaways from today's presentation. Next slide. Okay, we have now come to the question and answer portion of our time together. I know there have been a number of questions in the chat, which we are trying to address. I would like to open it up for additional responses from our experts for any of the questions that maybe haven't been answered yet. And then also I can open it up to any participants who would like to come off mute and share their questions or concerns as well. Yes, Abdish.
Hi, warm greetings. Thank you very much, Deborah. I'm a bit really unclear about the countries that are they emerging from conflict or crisis-affected countries where there is absence of a national standard framework. How would that work in terms of collecting data or measuring any kind of impact or performance that way? Thank you.
So in general, we do recognize the difficulty of measurement and using many of our indicators in situations of conflict and crisis. I would open this up to Rebecca Pagel. I think you might have additional insight there to give about those particular situations.
Thanks, Deborah. I'm not sure I have a lot more to add than you do, but I will just emphasize that we, Elena has something to say, but I'll just emphasize first that we do encourage any activity, regardless of the context, to select and report on indicators that are applicable to the programming. So we wouldn't expect any activity to report on indicators that aren't applicable to the programming, or for one reason or another are not feasible to collect. As an example, we have an indicator on average percent change in earnings, which in many contexts just cannot be collected. And so in those contexts, we would not encourage you to try to collect that data. There are a number of other different categories of indicators that are not standard foreign assistance indicators, but things like context indicators that you can capture in conflict and crisis settings to track what is happening in the context, how it's changing, and how that might be influencing the work that you are doing. But Elena is her hand up, so I'll hand it over to you to add more here.
Yeah, sure thing. This is a very relevant question for basic education, which indeed, since we are aligning our top line outcome indicators with the Sustainable Development Goals, do require indeed having the proficiency, local proficiency standards. So what to do if those are not available? Our performance indicator reference sheets provide guidance for what to do in such cases, such as falling back on internationally kind of recommended benchmarks. This is a one good solution. So again, check out the peers, and typically you will see solutions for such situations. Over.
And I will also just add, I see you have a question in the chat around specifically around the higher education framework and measurement in the absence of nationally agreed upon standards. Right now, most of our higher education indicators do look at outputs rather than outcomes, and that is something that we are working on to look at how to better measure learning outcomes in the higher education space. So I think hopefully within a couple of years, you're going to be able to see more from us on that end. But I think in reference to conflict affected countries and those in crisis, the same principles still apply that Rebecca and Elena just shared as well. Other questions?
So I think it's an important question to that Stephanie raised in the chat about what to do when ministry data does not line up with the actuals. I think this is a very common situation, and it's typical that targets can be, especially for output level indicators, can be based on ministry data. So we always encourage people to use actuals whenever possible, and write an explanation for deviation in your submission of your first reports. After that, working with your missions to adjust those targets based on the actuals. I think it's really important. So again, we have all sorts of solutions for this, but most importantly, work with your mission, and they will give you directions, because again, this is pretty common. Over.
There's also a question that has come up in the chat. Elena, potentially you could answer this one. The question is, to what degree, this is from Joseph, to what degree do you reference international sources of data, such as SDG 4, Education for All reports, or do we try to align with those sources?
So we provide data for SDG 4 in a way, right? So it's kind of the relationship is the other way around. Typically, what we're trying to do is to support partner governments in their efforts to report on SDG 4. So those data, of course, naturally are lagging. So I can't really imagine a situation when we would use those data, but rather, again, we work with the governments to ensure that whatever assessments we are funding, they can then use the results to report on it against SDG 4. Yeah, over. Jennifer's asking a really good question about target modification based on the actuals. So I think, again, given the situation of the pandemic, we're dealing with highly fluid situations in many countries. So I think it's an entirely reasonable conversation to have with your mission about targets and under such circumstances. And we are having the same conversations on our end with missions. They reach out to us also for guidance on this. So understandably, if some schools shut down and then when they reopen, we know that the enrollment is not going to be the same. We know that some of the monitoring work needs to happen to see how many kids come back to school. So all of this kind of volatility, of course, causes the situation where we need to revisit targets. So, of course, highly recommended to sit down with your mission once a year at least to talk about targets, to see what's reasonable and how those might need to be changed. Stephanie?
Thanks, Elena. And this is kind of a tag-on question pertaining to data quality, so to speak. And when you are finding that the numbers are either much higher or lower, I've found that the changing of the targets is sometimes rather locked in stone and not adjustable. But then we're finding very different numbers on site in monitoring. And so I just was curious if there was anything more kind of from a USAID reporting position around that.
So the system actually does allow going back and modifying the numbers that even were already entered. So there's quite a lot of flexibility. GIS is new though, so you may need to, again, work with your missions to see how the situation can be resolved in your specific case, because unfortunately we cannot just provide the general guidance, because again, even we are not very familiar yet with how GIS actually functions. So one good question in chat about indicators being preloaded. In the activity that I manage, it did come preloaded, but you're saying that maybe in your case it wasn't. Again, they rolling it out mission by mission, so it also could differ somewhat. My best advice is reach out to your COR, AOR, and work with them, because they will have best ability to answer.
I would also just mention that sometimes the holdup or the reticence to modify targets is at say a political level, and so that's why it becomes incredibly important to use this guidance from the get-go to set realistic targets. Of course, we can't control things like COVID or other external events that may then change reality, but we really encourage you to use the guidance both for the process and for some of the specific techniques that can be used to more accurately set targets. Thanks, Stephanie.
There is a good question from Anne-Marie about measurement indicators, quality of learning versus quantity. So I think that's where we had the biggest shift with this indicator framework from the previous one that was used under 2011 education strategy. If you compare that old framework with new one, you will see a dramatic shift from the emphasis on output level indicators to the increased emphasis on outcome level indicators. So we judge the quality of learning by actually measurable improvements in learning outcomes, right? So if we see that baseline to midline to end line, we have significantly increased proportion of learners who reach proficiency benchmarks or improve their learning expressed in different ways, then we know that the quality of education is improving, right? Especially if it's paired up with also increase in access. That's why we introduced this new access indicator. So yes, at the philosophical level, we are most definitely focused on improved learning and improved quality of education.
All right, I'll jump in. There's a question from Abdish on the higher education program framework, where two of the guiding principles are local ownership and sustainability. And so looking for clarification. So first, I'll put in the link to the program framework in the chat, so anyone can go in and look and read that. There's this link has not only the graphic that we had in the presentation, but also a write-up of what everything means. So you might get some answers there. But in general, local ownership and sustainability are part of the principles of our USAID education policy. So in our higher education work, as much of the work ongoing at USAID, we are always trying to hand ownership over to the local higher education institution that we're working with, for example, in part to ensure that the work that we do is sustainable, but also with the assumption that the local partner, the local AGI, knows more about the context and what to do and how to work in that context than we do. So that's a core value, I think, of our higher education work. And I think you'll hopefully see that reflected in a lot of the higher education activities that we do. If I can, Mamadou had a question on, there's lots of EG, economic growth indicators that apply to education. Should they be reported here in education or in economic growth? And actually the truth is that we call it own. We own several of those economic growth indicators. So we do get that data and look at it and use it to learn about our programming. So you can just, report to the indicator as it's listed, include it in your meal plan, report it up through, to your AOR, COR, and it will come to us and we'll look at the data and aggregate it and learn from it.
So Anne Marie has a question about measurement of indicators, quality of learning versus quantity, or outputs and numbers from a USAID perspective. So clearly we have indicators that represent both outputs and outcomes. We have a strong preference for being able to demonstrate outcomes because that is such an important part of the education policy. So wherever possible, we strongly encourage folks to use learning outcomes indicators. So if Elena or Rebecca have anything else to add to that, that would be helpful, but we strongly encourage all programming to look at learning outcomes.
Yeah, that's what that's the same question that I spoke to earlier, Deborah. I said the same thing, but the same way. Just like while we're waiting for more questions, since we have a couple more minutes, I just would like to encourage everyone to please read the peers. It's really important. We see time and again when folks submit stuff, and it's just, we update those peers and we improve the definitions. So sometimes if there's no, if people don't look closely enough at the methodology, for example, then they apply a methodological approach to measurement, which is not listed as acceptable, and there were cases when we had to disallow data to be entered into PPR, which is of course highly unfortunate for everyone. So please make sure that you review those. Those are not very long and completely available to you at any time. And if your mission colleagues give you directions that contradict the directions in the peers, please just refer them to the peers. And if necessary, just reach out to us, because again, we have had situations when we had to disallow data from being entered into PPR because the methodology was not followed. And for consistency purposes, it's very, very important that the partners report following the peers guidance. And I see Renan raise his hand. Go ahead.
Yes, just on like measuring academic achievement, for instance. I know that, we struggle with that because we have different ways to do it. We have national testing. Sometimes it's not very consistent. And I was wondering if at some point you have considered using like PISA or TIMSS, some of those international measurements. Maybe not all the countries can participate in that, but maybe have like a big sample and have that like a baseline, and then have another one like 4 or 5 years later, so we can have more consistent data on academic achievement.
Right. So we don't currently have indicators that correspond to the grades and subjects that that those tests measure, right? And in terms of, in general, international donor community does keep track of those through like the World Bank learning adjusted school years, for example, indicated that does include those tests into consideration when they compute those LACE indicators for specific countries. So I think in general, we do use them. We don't use them for activity purposes, reporting purposes, because typically, again, those are lagging. It takes some years for the country to set those up. They don't occur every year. They occur like every some years, right? Because they're quite expensive. And the results are not available until like a year after. So they're not really practical for measuring the impact of our activities. But they are very good as a general indicator of the overall quality of the education system's performance, for sure.
So there is a question on our access indicators. So from Mamadou, our new indicator on access, the question is, almost all access indicators are expressed in number. Those tend to be output indicators. Are there any outcome indicators for access? So our indicator does count, you're right, number of individuals. But I would like to argue that depending on the activity's theory of change, this indicator might actually be an outcome for an activity. And this brings up a really important, even though it says number, which I don't think necessarily that we could just as easily say % for this indicator. So this brings up though a really important point that we would encourage everybody to select indicators based on your activity theory of change. So, for example, if your activity is doing a lot of work, if your focus is on getting a specific population access to some kind of education, and you have several interventions that follow several causal pathways to get these children or youth or individuals in some kind of education, then them achieving access might be a really incredible outcome that you're looking for. So where that what that indicator is, if you use it, all really depends on that theory of change. There's another question from Baraket. I'll answer the number 2, but I'll hand number 1 back to Elena because it's on target setting. But the question is, can standard indicator pairs be amended in the description part with the local context? And the answer is yes, but with caveats. So the peers that we write, the standard indicator peers, are intended to provide an umbrella that everyone should adhere to if they're reporting on that indicator. But we try to leave enough leeway within the indicator that under that umbrella that you can make it contextually relevant. So for example, many of our outcome indicators have a couple of options available to you for the methodology used. You might choose a panel longitudinal sampling method. You might choose a cohort method, and those are both allowable under that peers. And you can choose which one is a best fit for your activity. And Elena, do you see this question from Baraket? Okay, great. I'll hand it to
Before
you.
I get to the target setting, though, I did want to highlight that our new standard indicator in distance learning is sort of like one of those access indicators that is also outcome level indicators. So back to the question about access and outcomes, right? Because the way how we set it up, it's basically requires activities to collect primary data on the use of the distance learning resources. So it's not just that we put up a radio program and we kind of let go at this, hoping that everybody within the catchment area will tune in. But no, you actually have to monitor the use. And I think this is really important because, again, this is where the access as an output measure overlaps here really well with like outcomes, that at least in terms of actual, absorption. And, people are tuning in, kids are tuning in, and they're trying to learn. So this is one, I think, good example. In terms of the target setting, yes, it's absolutely allowable and encouraged actually to modify targets based on the changes in your circumstances. In some contracts, it's even written in the crisis modifier if there is a crisis. But in general, under CLA, that is a framework that all missions, all activities are required to adhere to. Modifications to targets is seen as completely appropriate response to changes in external circumstances. So I would just say, again, talk to your mission, to your COR, AOR. They always have access to the most up-to-date guidance, and you can also go to the Learning Lab. The CLA page is always active and up-to-date. It will give you a lot of information about this. I think we're pretty much at time, Rebecca and Deborah, right?
I think so. There is this last question from Jennifer on the need to have fewer indicators, but also the need to report at each sub-IR. And yes, I think there is a need to be comprehensive, but also not to go overboard. So I think it's a bit of a balancing act in terms of choosing the number of indicators. But again, going back to that general principle of making sure that the indicators selected are best for decision making and management. So that would be the general guidance I'd give for your question, Jennifer. So I think, yes, we've come to the end of our time. Thank you so much for joining us. We hope this has been helpful. There will be a follow-up email to everyone who signed up for this session that will include links and some general takeaways. And of course, please use the ED indicators at usaid.gov with any further questions that you have. We're happy to answer them. Thanks so much.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.